keep on running. I keep on running. I keep on running. Running. Non-stop till they out of breath. Putting in about 1,000 reps. Addicted to the grind like a pound of meth. Schneider-Weiler, how I climb the best.
Welcome to the Football Autobiography Show. It is such a pleasure to be with you all today, wherever in the world you are listening. The Football Autobiography Show is dedicated to taking you on a football journey with football's most interesting players, coaches, trainers, staff, and journalists. Think of these as mini football autobiographies. Each guest will show you how they got where they are now, reveal their techniques for success, and what they've learned along the way. Our guest today is assistant manager of Seoul Eland Dan Harris. Before coaching at Seoul Eland, Harris was previously the head of sports science at Celtic, West Brom, and Birmingham City. He's also supported the U18, U19, and U20 English national teams with their sports science. In this episode, Harris talks about why he left Celtic and the game for 3 years, what he's learned from boxing, rowing, American football, and rugby, and how he's applied it to football, why he's turned down opportunities in Qatar and China, the differences in football in Korea versus the UK, how to balance fitness and freshness, how he trains his players for explosiveness, and the top resources coaches can use to expand their knowledge. This is an episode chock full of detailed insights and great quotes. Harris has a unique mind, and there is something in this episode for everyone. Without further ado, enjoy my chat with Dan Harris. It's a pleasure to speak to someone who's living in Korea. I used to live in Korea for 2 years, so this is an absolute treat.
Yeah, it's great. I'm sure we've got some shared experiences, and we can talk about all the great stuff of the country and also the challenges of being in a completely different culture as well. So
yeah, we'll get to a little bit of that later. But the first thing I wanted to ask you was I read a quote that when you were at Birmingham City, manager Steve Bruce described you as, quote, the loudest man in the world. Can you explain why he might have said that?
Yeah, I look back on my Birmingham days, and they were fantastic times. You know, we had a couple of great seasons in the English Premier League. I was working with some fantastic players, fantastic staff. Learned so much over that time. I think for me, really, the opportunity there was a great one because we had a lot of senior pros in our first year. So a lot of very experienced lads who had been around the block, had kind of been there, done that, got the T-shirt. And really in that scenario, in that environment, the challenge for me was to say, how can you motivate millionaires? You know, how can you persuade guys that have been there and done that to go further than they've ever gone before, to dig deeper than they've ever dug before? I always talk about having a toolbox, and actually every situation you find yourself in, having to use different tools in different situations. And in that situation, you know, the challenges we were facing, it was part of my remit, part of my brief was being the guy that could get guys up and going in the start of the day and could inject a bit of life and a bit of spark into what we were doing. And I took my lead from Steve on that. You know, Steve had a fantastic ability to connect with players and a fantastic ability to motivate and get alongside big name players particularly. And so for me, that was a great learning curve. But yeah, certainly myself and Steve had a good relationship. It was a great working with him, learned a lot, made plenty of mistakes, but yeah, look back on that time very fondly.
So you were like the drill sergeant, the fiery motivator in that sense.
Yeah, like I said, I think you've got to be a bit of a chameleon really and adapt to the situation you find yourself in, you know. So there's days where you've got to be very, very low key and just go about your business quietly behind the scenes, and there's days where you've got to light a fire on people, you know, and that's all part of that broad toolkit you've got to have to work in professional sport, particularly in professional football. When you're working with senior players, you've got to have that ability to know when to dial things up and know when to tone things down a little bit. So, it's the old cliche, you can't fix everything with a hammer. So you've got to have multiple tools in your toolbox, but certainly the ability to every now and again have a little chirp up at someone, have a little bite at somebody doesn't always hurt, you know.
Now I've always been. I'm from New York, and I'm always been talked about as a loud person. As a child, or when you were growing up and playing football, what were you like as a teenager and evolving in your football career?
Yeah, interesting. It's a long time ago now. I think probably I can trace the interest in coaching back to an early age, in the sense of I'm the eldest of four lads. There's four boys in my family, which I'm the eldest. So obviously the age I'm at, we grew up before the internet was really about, before kind of games consoles and stuff were prevalent. So, every waking minute when we weren't in school, we were out and about playing. We were out in the street playing football, we were out in the gardens, out in the parks, wherever we could find. And myself, my brothers, and kind of friends in the area we lived in, we'd just be out with the ball all the time. And being the oldest in that particular group, and often it falls to you to be the one that organises things and gets the teams organised and all that kind of stuff. So I think probably without realising it, the foundation for that was laid pretty early. And then, obviously grew up playing all kinds of sports, as a lot of guys and girls do these days. Grew up playing multi-sports at multiple levels and really enjoyed it. It wasn't good enough at any one sport to go off and pursue a career full-time in that. It was, I always laughed about my own football career being cut short by a serious long-term lack of ability. So I worked my socks off and played at a decent level, but knew I wasn't going to have to pay the bills doing that, and so made that move into coaching fairly early. And I think really served an apprenticeship. I mean, this is my 20th season now coaching full-time, so I can look back on those early days and you cringe sometimes at the mistakes you made, but you're also grateful for the opportunities because it helps shape you into the coach you are today.
Yeah, I can totally relate to not having the long-term skills to play football professionally, as I'm sure most people listening can relate to that as well. So what drew you to sports science in particular? Because that's kind of how you got your start. Yeah,
so I mean, I obviously from the UK, kind of born in England and grew up in England. Spent a lot of time working in Scotland as I got older, but really, at the time that I ended up going to university, I ended up at a university called Loughborough University in England, which is at the time back in the 90s was really the leader in the UK in terms of sports science. And sports science as a concept was only just really beginning to break into football. It'd been talked about and utilised in other sports for a while, but certainly in terms of professional football in England, it was a little bit late coming to the party potentially. And so for me, I was very fortunate because the timing just worked out well, in the sense of the time that I was at Loughborough studying sports science was the time that the whole kind of movement to try and professionalise football a little bit more was beginning to gather momentum. So there was a group of about 3 or 4 guys who were probably 3 or 4 years older than me, who really were the trailblazers here in England in terms of sports science within professional football or soccer for the American listeners. And those guys were working for the Football Association, and they'd all come through the program at Loughborough.
Can you mention who those people are just quickly?
Yeah, absolutely, certainly. So I mean, you're talking about people like Steve McGregor, who's now or certainly has been up till recently, the conditioning coach for Rory McIlroy, the golfer. Tony Strudwick, who for a long time was at Manchester United and is now in a more of a kind of strategic role there. Rich Hawkins, who's been at Man United recently as well, and before that was at the FA for a long time. So really a group of guys, if you like, who came through 3 or 4 years before me and really blazed the trail a little bit. And for me, particularly, I guess the key turning point was as a kind of second-year student, a big pharmaceutical company called GlaxoSmithKline, who owns Lucozade Sport, which is a big energy drink in the UK, in England particularly. They were doing a lot of their lab-based research at Loughborough into sports nutrition. And because I had a background in football and background in coaching and playing, myself and 2 others were seconded onto their research program. And our remit really was being in the lab, collecting data directly related to kind of elite football performance, and then going into football clubs, delivering nutrition presentations and conditioning sessions. And really that was the timing of that was perfect, because clubs were beginning to show an interest in that. And because I was given the window to go into clubs, it actually followed that the opportunities then came off the back of that for me to go in more regularly to clubs and eventually then to start going in full-time to places. So, yeah, it was kind of standing on the shoulders of giants, some good people that had blazed a bit of a trail. And there were obviously people before that as well, but those kind of 3 or 4 particularly were guys that were doing a good job at the time. And then myself and people like Sam Eric, who's now been at Man City for a long time and had been at Tottenham before that, were coming through, and 2 or 3 other guys in kind of similar age and stage to me were coming through. And we've been kind of very fortunate to go on and be involved in professional football for a long time now.
So you were able to do all of these like trainings with these clubs, but you still said it was at the time it was still pretty revolutionary or new. So what did you know that, clubs were just willing to take on sports scientists at that point, or how did you enter the field after Loughborough University? Because I know there's a lot of people now that are, getting these sports science degrees and kind of unsure of how to move forward.
Yeah, absolutely. I think for me, at the time that I was starting out, like I said, in the late 90s, there were no kind of internships that you'd see these days, or kind of secondments, or, PhD placements or MRes placements. They just didn't exist really. So the way that my opportunity came about was that I was going into clubs delivering nutrition presentations on behalf of kind of Lucozade Sport, and that was unpaid. That was part of our kind of secondment as well as in the lab work. And one of the teams that I went into was a team called Peterborough United, who was a smaller team in England at the time. I was also still playing kind of non-league locally and coaching as well. And a combination of me having already been in there, and then I took a team across to play a friendly exhibition game against one of the Peterborough teams, so their kind of reserve team. I was chatting to their head coach, their gaffer afterwards, and because obviously there'd been the connection previously with me in the presentation, he then asked me to go in the following week and do a little bit of work with their younger players, their kind of 18, 19-year-olds. And I went in once, and the players were great, really responsive to it, and that then grew into me going in once a week and then twice a week, and eventually I was going in kind of 3.5 days a week, kind of unpaid, so getting up at 5 o'clock in the morning and driving across kind of 2.5 hours or so to the training ground, doing a session, coming back, going off to my lectures in the afternoon, and then going off to training myself in the evening for playing still, So I certainly put the hours in, as you've got to do in this industry, certainly put the time in and the miles in. And that's no different these days. I think the advice I give to young guys out there is that you've got to check your ego in at the door. You've got to have the humility that says, just because you've got a good degree or just because you've got some experience, you are still bottom of the food chain. And that's not meant to be a harsh statement. It's just the reality that this is a saturated market these days, and you've got to be prepared to put a shift in and graft and humble yourself and take on low-paid opportunities and work antisocial hours just to get the miles on the clock, because there's simply no substitute for hours on the grass, hours in the gym, and it's not sexy advice, it's not the kind of advice that the young guys want to hear, but it is the reality of it, in the sense of this job is a graft, and it is and that doesn't change. And just because you end up working full time in it, that work ethic still underpins everything we have to do. For me, it's a sense of recognising that this is a privilege to work in this career, and there's plenty of people better than me who had one opportunity and never worked again, for different reasons that were out of their control. And I've been very fortunate that I've been able to take those early experiences and still stay in the game for 20 years.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like that's the case for a lot of jobs in the football industry in particular versus other industries, is you really have to work those unsociable hours, and especially early on in your career. And I want to talk, though, about getting that work-life balance maybe later in your career, a little bit later in the interview. But it seems like it's difficult.
Yeah, certainly it is. It's I think, again, we'll touch on that later on, but I think there's this guy, Tony Dungy, who's a kind of hero of mine, kind of a long-time NFL coach, so with the Colts in Indianapolis, first African-American coach to win the Super Bowl. He talked about not mistaking extra hours for achievement. It doesn't necessarily mean extra hours don't automatically lead to achievement. There's a balance between activity and achievement, and actually recognising that you need to have that balance as human beings. You need men that have got balance working around you, women that have got balance working around you if you're going to be successful, and particularly if you're going to have longevity in this career,
Yeah, no, exactly. I couldn't agree more. But I want to get back to your time when you were with West Brom and Celtic. I read that you really enjoyed working in Scotland in particular. Can you explain why and what it was like working at Celtic?
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess to plug some of those gaps. So I started out at Peterborough part-time, and then went to Coventry City full-time for about 4.5 years. And that was a team in the Championship at that time, kind of the second tier within the English football. And then from Coventry went to Birmingham City for 3 years. And alongside my time at Birmingham and Coventry was also working on a secondment basis for the Football Association with the national team, so covering the international squads as they went abroad for tournaments and games. And then went off and did 18 months at West Brom, and then a couple of seasons up at Celtic. And And yeah, for those people that perhaps aren't aware of Celtic as a club, well, I grew up in England, but Celtic and Rangers, or the old firm as they're known, are two huge institutions. I mean, whichever side of the fence you're on, or whichever club you have an affiliation with, the reality is both of those institutions are huge clubs in their own right. They have a huge fan base. They have a huge history, rich history, both of them, both domestically and in European competitions. And whilst people perhaps might look at Scotland as a smaller nation, they are two kind of mammoth clubs playing up in that country. And so for me, having spent all my time in England in the Premier League and Championship and the national teams, when the opportunity came to come and work at a team like Celtic, that is an opportunity that you can't take lightly. You know, they are huge clubs, a club that's won the Champions League historically, a country that has achieved huge things, a club that's achieved huge things. And really, for me, the opportunity was one that I couldn't turn down. You know, the chance to go and be involved in Champions League football, the chance to go and work in a slightly different culture, different country, to be out of my comfort zone a little bit, was one that I couldn't turn down. And whilst I was only there for a couple of seasons, it was a fantastic opportunity. You know, really a real challenge professionally. 1 minute you're playing a huge Champions League or Europa League game on a Wednesday night in front of 60,000 people, and then 3 days later you're playing in front of 5,000 people, you know, in a small provincial town. So the challenge for players, mentally and physically, was significant, and certainly for a coach was a real challenge, a different challenge from one I'd had previously. So yeah, really enjoyed my time up there. Some great people, and obviously the club have gone on from strength to strength in the last 3 or 4 years, and last season particularly. For those that don't know, I mean, the team went undefeated through a whole season, and domestically, to do that in any league, any country in the world, that's a huge testament to the quality of people working there now and the quality of players working there, and also speaks a lot to the size of the club, you know.
Yeah, you mentioned how you had such a good time there. You took a 2-year hiatus. What was the impetus for that, if you were having such a good time up there?
Yeah, so my time at Celtic finished after a couple of seasons, and my wife and children had obviously come up to Scotland with me, and that was a big move for them because they were very settled down in the south of England where we grew up and where they'd grown up. So we'd moved up to Scotland, been up there for a couple of years, and really fell in love with the country. You know, absolutely loved being up there, loved the people, loved the way they didn't take themselves too seriously, loved their attitude to life, I loved the countryside. We lived out in the middle of nowhere, out in the hills, you know, just away from civilization, no mobile phone signal, you know, beautiful part of the world. And we just loved it up there. And we just felt as though, although my time at Celtic had come to an end, we weren't ready to leave the country yet. You know, we just felt as though we loved it up there. I was fortunate in the sense of I had a number of opportunities to come straight back down south to work in England again, a couple of teams. But really at that point, I'd been in the game probably 15 years at that point, and I'd been very fortunate to have worked at multiple levels and multiple people and learnt loads, made lots of mistakes, but didn't just want to jump into the first job that was offered to me. You know, I wanted to reflect a little bit on what I'd done at that time, reflect on the mistakes I'd made, reflect on the good stuff we'd done, both at Celtic and previously at other clubs as well, and really just learn. Because at that point, you know, when you've been nose to the grindstone for so long, and we've already talked about how relentless this job can be, when you're working that hard and you're investing so much in people, it's crucial to get that balance where you can go off and keep learning yourself, you know, and study other sports and study business and study in other areas so you can come back even better than you were before, you know. So yeah, it was a choice we made as a family. Great. I did all sorts of stuff over the course of that 2 years, you know, travelled, studied, met people, tried completely different jobs, just went off and took myself out of my comfort zone, really. And there's no doubt it's made me a better man, no doubt it's made me a better coach.
Yeah, no, I've noticed it happened, or it happens a lot more now in American sports. There's been a couple famous coaches in the NBA that have taken, after they've gotten fired from their team, have taken a year off instead of just jumping to the next ship immediately, and have watched other teams run practices and how they do things in other cultures, so that they can take that to their next job. And it seems very similar to you. So I'm curious, what sports did you watch? And you said you did some traveling. Where did you go?
Yeah, so I really went all over the place. So I had I'm a huge NFL fan, a huge fan of American football. So I had a 4-week kind of study trip out to the US. And during that time, I had the chance to go and meet guys working on the recruitment side from the New York Giants. went to go and watch the Rangers ice hockey train. I spent some time at the New York Jets training facility, went down to the IMG Academy and spent some time there, went across to Exos, or Athletes Performance as it was then, and met with a guy called Mark Verstegen there and spent some time watching their kind of physical preparation. So that was kind of one block of time that I'd spent. Went off and I was really a big fan of boxing, so spent some time working in a boxing gym up in Scotland, just kind of watching the way they coach and watching the way they go about things, and did some entry-level coaching qualifications in that. Went off and spent some time in business, just meeting guys for the business side of things, because the more this game's evolved, the more we have to be well-rounded and recognise that this is an industry, not just a sport. And there's a business component to that. Jeff Reinbolt, who's a coach up in the Canadian Football League now, talks a lot about the business of the business. And I think these days modern coaches have to have an understanding of that, not necessarily be in control of it or strive to take on roles that are outside of their remit, but certainly have a working understanding of the business of the business. So I spent some time doing that. Went off and did another degree, the teaching qualification, because the longer I spent in the other side of coaching, the more I realised that this is about relationships and it's about teaching. It's about how can you convey your message across, how can you make sure that the people you're working with staff and players, the message is getting through. People talk a lot about communication in coaching and assume that is talking, but actually it's not about talking, it's about making sure the message is heard. And how can you make sure that communication, your teaching styles are such that the information you're trying to convey is getting through. So, yeah, really went off and studied all sorts. Spent some time watching Brits rowing at the time, who've been very successful at the Olympic level. I've got a really strong program. And obviously went off into football and watched other coaches work and updated my coaching qualifications. And yeah, just enjoyed it. Spent some time working in a prison up in Scotland, Offenders Institute. That was magnificent and great up there. Real privilege to work up there with those guys. And yeah, just wanted to get a sense of the world and a sense of how things can be done, because people talk a lot about philosophy in football. What is your philosophy? And I understand what they're saying. I'm not in any way kind of ridiculing or belittling that, but for me, it's very much about the situation you find yourself in as opposed to philosophy, and saying, when you arrive in a new place and you look at the situation you're in, you look at the people you're working with, how can you be successful in that particular environment? What does it take to win in that particular setting? It's not so much about how you think it should be done. It's about being a pragmatist and saying, in this particular setting, with the resources that we have and the restrictions that we have, what's it going to take to win? And I think that idea of having more than one string to your bow and more than one tool in your toolbox is pretty important,
Yeah, well, I guess it kind of goes to, it's easier to change one person if you're that person than to change the entire environment around you. If you understand what I'm saying.
I think the way I was speaking to a young coach on the phone last night, and I think the thing that I've, come to understand over the years is that in any area of life, but particularly in coaching, there are things that you can control, there are things that you can influence, and there are things you have to accept. And I think it's really important for us as coaches, particularly young coaches, that we have to look at the situation we're in. We have to classify every situation correctly and say, which one of those three parameters does this particular situation fit in? Which are the things I have to control and can control? What are the things that I can only influence? And what are the things that I've got to accept? And I think one of the reasons why young coaches get frustrated, particularly, can be that they've either miscategorized the situation, so thinking they can control it when they can only influence it, or thinking they can control it when they have to accept it. And actually, the reality of it is that we have to classify those things accurately to make sure that we're using the limited amount of energy and time that we have as effectively as possible. And I think that those kind of couple of years away from football particularly really helped me with that, in terms of going back in and saying, when I go into my next situation, how can I categorize the different challenges I face into those three zones?
I really like that idea, categorizing what you can influence, what you have to accept, and what you can control. That's actually, and that's just not true for football. That's true for life in any field as well. What you said with your like travels. There's just so many different routes I want to go down. But unfortunately, I don't have all day with you. But I want to hit a couple of the things that you said. One, you said you studied a bunch of different sports. You mentioned my favorite American football team, the New York Jets. What is...
Okay. I want to put on record, I'm actually a Baltimore Ravens fan, so whilst I had the chance to learn from the Giants, they'll never turn into the dark side. I'm still a Ravens fan. So.
Oh, well, I have to ask now then, why the Ravens? That's a pretty random team in my estimation.
Yeah, it is. I think I'm probably in an audience of one here in the UK in terms of Ravens fans. I think this American football in the UK, the coverage of it has kind of been pretty sporadic. I mean, as a kid, there was we had one TV channel that once a week would show like an hour highlights package. As a kid, this is going back to the kind of 80s now, and I remember kind of tuning in once a week and watching that and being fascinated by this kind of mysterious sport from across the pond. And then kind of my interest in it waned a little bit. And then around the kind of time I was at university, around the kind of 90s or so, was the time that the Ravens were just coming online, if you like, as an expansion franchise. Obviously, the scandal in terms of them leaving Cleveland and things. And really, because my interest level had been reworked in the sport, the fact that team was starting at the same time that I was getting back into it really was a natural fit for me. So kind of watching them from the very earliest outset and the very early kind of stages, and then obviously seeing them win their first Super Bowl and then obviously then move through and then more recently win their second Super Bowl with kind of John Harbaugh and Joe Flacco and stuff has been a great experience. So yeah, huge Ravens fan. Not many of us around here, but yeah, certainly looking forward to the new season there as well. Watching the training camp coverage at the moment, looking forward to watching Hard Knocks when that starts and all the stuff you can learn from that. So yeah, just at the moment, just diving into the kind of the streaming of the LA Rams from last season. So looking forward to kind of watching into that as well. So yeah, huge NFL fan.
Yeah, well, it's it's quite hard to watch when you're in Korea. As I remember when I was there, it was just, I mean, the timing is just terrible because of the time zones. It's horrible for watching the NFL in Korea. But
yeah, no, absolutely. So I think for me, if I've got to prioritize my family first, and then my job, and I've got to put sleep in there somewhere as well. So I can't be giving up my entire night. But yeah, I do the best I can to follow it, and I guess with the joys of the internet these days, you can kind of catch up on things pretty quickly as well.
Yeah, exactly. So what did you, when you were studying these NFL teams, boxing, rowing, what did you take from them to now your job in Korea, or that you've translated to football?
Yeah, okay. So I guess if we go to those particular three sports that you mentioned, if you start with the rowing scenario, what I love there was that that's a sport that it works on Olympic cycles, so works on 4-year cycles, so very, very different from professional football where I work, where we've got a peak every week, twice a week for 10 months of the year. For them, they'll have world championships, obviously, and European championships, but the focus really is to work for 4 years to peak for 4 minutes. That's effectively what they're talking about. And I think what I took from them was the constant pursuit of fine detail to help them improve. So the mantra they would talk about was, does it make the boat go faster? So whatever they're looking at, whether it's biomechanics, whether it's nutrition, whether it's recruitment, whether it's physical training, psychology, that the ultimate question that they would distill everything down to is this going to make the boat go faster? And if it's going to make us 0.002 seconds faster, then we're prepared to commit to it, But ultimately, does it make the boat go quicker? And that constant pursuit of gains, that constant pursuit of improvement, of getting the small things right, was certainly something I took from that, because I looked in professional football and with all the money washing around in professional football in Europe particularly, you only have to go onto the internet now and Google pre-season. You'll see teams all around Europe kind of with lads doing all kinds of amazing looking things on the TV in terms of their training, the way they train, the way they recover. Yet the question that I have to ask myself, and I've got to ask probably us as a sport, is that have we got the basics right? I'm not sure necessarily that we're doing the core fundamental requirements ruthlessly well enough before we can start getting into the salad dressing.
Can you explain which like fundamentals you might be referring to?
Yeah, absolutely. So for me, I think the principle of elite performance is getting the right raw material looked after properly. So your recruitment's got to be right. You've got to make sure that you're bringing the right raw material into your building, and you've got to make sure that you're looking after it as well as you possibly can. And looking after it covers every single area, physical, technical, tactical, psychological, social, spiritual. You've got to make sure that raw material is being looked after properly. Now, the example I would give is that I've seen players, and I'm not going to name them, but I've seen players over the course of the year that will will spend upwards of £3,000-4,000 on nutritional supplements over the course of the season because they've got the money to do that, and yet on an away game on the way back when they get in the car, we'll stop off at the drive-thru at McDonald's on the way back. Now I'm not hammering McDonald's. I'm not saying you can never eat fast food, but for me, it's about getting the strong foundations in place before you talk about the marginal gains. That whole phrase, marginal gains, has gained a lot of traction in recent years, and a lot of people talk about, that fine detail, and that's great, and it's important to do that in elite sport. But, our boys lifting weights properly in the gym? Are they being externally loaded in the right way, or are they bouncing on one foot on a Boso ball, wearing an altitude mask, using medicine balls, without really having any kind of understanding of how to control their body? When you're looking at speed and explosiveness, are lads actually sprinting on a regular basis as part of their training program? That ultimately, if you want to get quicker, you've got to sprint. Are boys shifting weight explosively in the gym? Are they recovering properly? Are they eating properly? Are they sleeping properly? Just the boring, unsexy things that actually, I believe, underpin performance. That's what we've got to devote the majority of our time, energy and money. And then once we've got those kind of being done ruthlessly well on a consistent basis, at that point we can start overlaying the marginal gain, fine detail stuff, And I think the question that I've got to ask our industry, and I've certainly got to keep reminding myself, is, are our fundamentals right? Are we doing the right things at the right time on a regular basis?
Yeah, I mean, it's the foundation for everything, getting the fundamentals right, and then you can move to the details. But can you get back to? I know this is my fault for taking you off topic, but can you get back to? Because I was really curious as what you took from American football or some of the other sports. Because I know I interrupted you.
No, not at all. Yes, so the rowing also you covered. The second one was obviously boxing. I think the thing for me that I took from them is those guys are phenomenal athletes. I mean, phenomenal athletes. We've got guys in professional football that complain if they're doing more than 2 hours a day. Sometimes, they'll talk. You've got this culture now where athletes and footballers and sportsmen. The workout doesn't count unless you've taken a photo of yourself doing it and put it on Instagram. That's the culture these days. If you need to show the world you're working well. I've got to say what I've taken from boxing is those boys just graft. The vast majority of guys that I saw training were not professionals. They would work. They'd have to work. So they'd get up early in the morning and go off and do their running, conditioning work first thing in the morning, go off and do a full day's work and then come back to the gym in the evening. And the work ethic these guys had in there, the fighters that I saw and had a chance to work alongside were just phenomenal in terms of the hours they put in. So I think what I took from boxing particularly was that sense of what the human body is actually capable of tolerating. And actually, I think the danger sometimes is we talk so much about kind of red zones and overloading players and, wanting to keep them fresh and things that we actually lose sight of the resilience that you need to develop by actually having a training stimulus that actually fatigues you. I've seen players who've got phenomenal recovery strategies in place, but they haven't worked hard enough to justify having that recovery. So that's certainly what I've taken from boxing. And then in terms of the NFL, there's so many ways you can go with that, so much you can take from that. If I could just give some very specific examples, what I was interested in was looking at the process behind the combine. So again, for those in the UK who would be listening to this, you perhaps don't understand that the combine obviously is effectively like a meat market. It's where as you know yourself, the best prospects from around the US will be invited in, and they'll go through a series of physical tests and psychological metrics and field-based tests as well, so the data can be collated, normalised and shared around all the teams. And what I was interested in particularly was looking at the way they profile psychologically. So how do they assess someone's character, which is a huge area that I think gets neglected in professional sport. I'm not sure necessarily the NFL has got that right, but they've certainly got some good stuff in place in terms of the way they do that. So certainly taken some stuff from that. Other specifics that I've taken, one of my heroes is a guy, Barry Sanders, who was a running back with the Detroit Lions for a long time. What I used to love about Barry Sanders was that this is a guy who, the things he could do on the field were ridiculous in terms of change of direction, the way he could move, his body control. And yet every time he broke that plane and made it into the end zone, the first thing he'd do was look for an official and just toss the ball to him, and he didn't have any elaborate celebrations. He didn't go off kind of shaking popcorn into his helmet or diving onto the fans. When he was interviewed about it, he said, he wanted to act in a way that he expected to score, and he expected to be in the end zone. it wasn't a surprise for him. He didn't want to celebrate wildly because that was his job. That's what he felt was important. And that almost humility, that single-minded commitment to excellence was something that I took from him. Really enjoyed that. Loved looking at some of the stuff that Tom Lange as a coach. Obviously, a coach will be close to your heart as a Giants fan. A guy there who, what I loved about him was, he talked about when things were difficult and things were hard and there was pressure and it was all the stress was happening around him, his players need to look at him and need to know that he was in control. And his calmness and his persona on the sidelines, both at practice and in game day, really kind of resonated with me. I see so many coaches who are very, very demonstrative, would gesticulate on the sideline and scream and shout. And again, that's their style. I'm not criticising them, but I love the quote from Coughlin, another Giants coach, and he talks about how both panic and calm are contagious. Both of those emotions are contagious, and the idea of having a calmness, I think, is something I've tried to take into my coaching more recently, just so I can conserve my energy and use it most appropriately, but secondly, so my players that I'm working with know that I know what I'm talking about. Ultimately, I want them to look at me and say, that's somebody who can make me better. That's somebody who I'll follow because I believe he's in control of what he's doing. So I love that. Again, there are people in the NFL that haven't got that. Again, I'm risking kind of alienating some fans here, but within the AFC North, where the Ravens play, they've got the Bengals, who I would argue probably have had a few meltdowns over the last couple of years in terms of the way they conduct themselves. So, again, I'm not to say that everyone's calm in the NFL, because that's certainly not the case, but certainly took that from that. And then, just in terms of their commitment to the conditioning side of things, because of the agreement in place in terms of the collective bargaining agreement there's a limited amount of time that players can spend in the building. And so the role of the strength coach in the NFL particularly has really evolved in the last few years. And just looking at the way the relationship between the strength coach and the athletes has been so significant, I think it has been really key. And certainly for me, trying to bridge that gap between sports science, conditioning, and then the coaching side of things, that's certainly an area that I feel very passionate about. I think in football particularly, we've got a little problem with that at the moment in terms of the chasm between those two disciplines being pretty big, So certainly took those things from my study of the NFL.
No, I mean, that's an incredible breakdown, and the Barry Sanders highlights speak for themselves. He didn't need to celebrate any touchdowns for you to rewatch his touchdown runs over and over again. But I read that you actually took a specific exercise, or not exercise, but you noticed something specifically, which was that from rugby, which was exercise bikes for substitutes. Can you explain what I'm referring to?
Yeah, of course. Just a really small thing. Again, we talk about kind of, I guess, preparation for performance. One of the daft things in professional football is that if we look at the science, the science would generally tell us that the body takes about 15 or 20 minutes to return to resting levels after exercise. So, again, it's arbitrary. You can look at different papers in terms of the detail of that. But generally, after exercise, that 15, 20-minute period sees the heart rate come down, sees the body temperature begin to drop a little bit. Now, what tends to happen in English football is that you go out for your warm-up at the start of the game beforehand, and then generally you'll go into the locker room or the kind of changing room kind of 20, 25 minutes before kickoff, and you'll come out again ready for kickoff 25 minutes later. Now, firstly, during that time, you need to make sure you've got some things in place to make sure that the core body temperature and muscle temperature isn't dropping too far, and that you're kind of maintaining better readiness. But then secondly, for the guys that sit on the bench that may well be called upon at any given point, what generally happens in England is that the substitutes will sit on the bench for the first 35 minutes of the game, and then may well go out and do a little light jog 5 minutes before half time, and then at half time we'll do a little bit of activation work and dash a few balls around, and then we'll kind of take turns going out and warming up kind of sporadically during the second half. And again, it's not to say that that's wrong, it's not to say that that's kind of imperfect, but for us here in Korea, we didn't have the limitation of only having 2 or 3 people warming up at a time. All of our subs can warm up at the same time. And what the rugby guys would do is they'd have a series of spinning bikes just directly next to the bench or the dugout. And they just have boys spinning on there right through the second half, right through the first half, just keeping the legs ticking over. Couple of advantages for that. Firstly, you're kind of maintaining that muscle temperature. You're kind of making sure they're still moving. Secondly, the position of the bikes is such that they've got to watch the game. They can't kind of sit down and study the floor or chat to the mate. They're there facing the game, so it's giving them the opportunity to actually study the game that they can have an impact on. There's a guy called Ole Gunnar Solskjaer, who was a very famous striker for Manchester United probably 10 years or so ago, and he would regularly spend most of his time on the bench and often come on and impact games in the last 20 minutes. And he would talk about how his mindset was that he obviously wanted to start games, but if he was coming off the bench, he wanted to cram 90 minutes work into 20 minutes. And he wanted to make sure that he'd really studied the centre half he was playing against, so that when he got on there, he could capitalise on things he'd seen in the first 17 minutes by watching the game when he then came in to take a part in it. And that sense of, I guess, guys on the bench, substitutes, being actively involved in the game, even when they're not playing, is something that we've tried to bring a little bit over here in the first couple of years in career. And again, it's a tiny little adjustment, little tweak, and it wouldn't be for everybody, but it's something that I saw in rugby quite liked and tried to bring into football as well.
I'm so happy you mentioned that about Ole Gunnar Solskjaer, because it's so true, and I actually really want to have him on the podcast, because he's actually quite a successful coach at Molde right now. I think in Norway.
Yeah, fascinating guy. So, I mean, certainly if you got him on the podcast, I'll be the first one tuning in to listen to him, because for a guy like that, who just the psychological side of things, because players want to play, that's what they want to do. Yet for him, much of his Man United career particularly was spent, behind other strikers, and yet he's still revered at that club. When he goes back to Man United now, he's treated like a hero. Now, of course, part of that is because of the impact in the Champions League final he had, but for me, that's the mark of his character and his work ethic, but secondly, his approach to the game, that even now, a club that he spent most of his time on the bench for, he's considered to be a bit of an icon. So yeah, fascinating guy.
We're considering, I know you said in previous podcasts that you had opportunities possibly in Qatar and China, but instead chose Korea. Why did you choose Korea over those opportunities in those two countries where a lot of coaches are going now?
Yeah, again, I can only speak for myself, in terms of every coach has to make their own decision in terms of where they choose to go and work and the approach they want to take. The opportunity I had to go to China was one that came out of the blue. It was working with someone that I hadn't worked with before. It wasn't a really country I'd thought much about, to be quite honest with you, and it's not being disrespectful at all to either the country or the industry. It just hadn't really been on my radar previously. And to be quite honest with you, the reason why I turned the job down was I just felt as though I'd have been taking it for the wrong reasons. Financially it was been great, and there was a decent package that was being offered and things, but again, it's the old cliche again, jobs fill the pockets, but adventures fill the soul. And I think I'd been taking that job for the wrong reason. It just didn't feel right. It didn't feel as though there was an opportunity to build something long term. It didn't feel as though there was an opportunity there to kind of share and learn. I'm very keen that whenever I go into a club, wherever I take an opportunity on, I want to go and contribute and work my socks off to help leave the place better than when I found it. But at the same time, I want to be working with people that challenge me, that I can learn from as well. And there's got to be some kind of structure in place. So if I'm doing the same things in 10 years' time that I'm still doing now, I'll have failed as a coach, and I want to make sure that I'm to keep pushing myself all the time. So, yeah, it just didn't really feel that the fit probably wasn't right professionally, and also personally, it probably came a little bit early. As I mentioned earlier on, family-wise, we were very settled up in Scotland. And my third child, my wife and I just had our third child up there, and she was kind of 18 months at that point, and we probably weren't quite ready to take that big jump at that stage. So that was that one. And then, the Qatar one, similar. Again, contract-wise, would have been okay. But again, I just didn't light a fire under me as a challenge. For me, I'm not in this game for the money. Of course, you've got to pay the bills, you've got to support our families, but it's about, I want to look back on my career when I'm 85, 90 years old, sitting in a rocking chair somewhere and think that, do you know what, I squeezed the juice out of every last day that I had. I made every single day count, and that I made choices for the right reasons. And so, for me, those two just didn't feel right. No disrespect to those countries. Not saying I wouldn't ever work there in the future by any means. And I know that I've got friends working in both places now who are having a great time, and friends that have worked in other countries have had a terrible time. So, just for me, neither of those opportunities were quite right. The timing wasn't quite right.
You mentioned that you look up to Tony Dungy and Tom Landry, and you've mentioned a couple others, and this decision that you had to come to Korea is quite a big one. Did you draw inspiration from any other person, or did you seek advice from anyone before you made this big decision?
Yeah, certainly the first person I spoke to was my wife. Obviously, that goes without saying. You know,
I would hope.
Absolutely, yeah. And it's not always the case, unfortunately, in football. You know, I have to say, there's certainly stories out there of people not necessarily perhaps having that relationship in place. But yeah, I think in all seriousness, those of us that have been in coaching for a long time, and this is a very, very volatile industry. It is a very changeable industry, and things do change very, very quickly. And you can be out of work very quickly, and you can be in work very quickly. And actually, the role that your partner or your spouse plays in that is huge. You know, my wife, Katie, we've been together for a long, long time now and been married for a long time. And I don't underestimate the impact on her life that my job has had. You know, she's had to drop things and relocate with very little notice. You know, she's had to put her own career on hold as we've gone around. She's chosen to. She hasn't had to. She's chosen to. And that's something I take kind of very, very seriously. And I'm very fortunate to have had a wife who supported me in that way. So, and I think for all of us who are involved in coaching, we mustn't underestimate the impact that our job has, you know, on our partners. If those of us that are kind of married or in relationships, and for us, it's a vocation. You know, it's not a job. This coaching is a vocation, but for our partners, it's their life. You know, they end up traveling around the world, and we know what we're going to. We know the job we're going to. Whereas my wife's had to kind of travel the world and build a home for us as a family, kind of in 3 different countries now. So I don't underestimate that by any means. I mean, in terms of other people, yeah, I think what's really important, something that I would really advise young coaches to have, and this is something that's really helped me, is kind of a principle based around the 4 points of a compass. So if you imagine putting yourself in the middle of a compass, and then you've got north, east, south, west, I think it's really crucial to be deliberate in putting somebody in each of those 4 quadrants. So what I mean by that is north of you, so above you, having somebody that is more experienced than you, that is wiser than you, probably older than you, who can hold you to account, that can act as a mentor, that can ask you difficult questions, that can be that sounding board in situations like that. So making sure you're deliberate in asking somebody to be in that role. You've got to have someone south of you, doesn't matter what your age is. I think you've got to have somebody younger than you, and maybe more than one person who you can just share your experience with. And even if you're a 21, 22-year-old coach, there'll be a 16, 17-year-old player out there that you might be able to spend some time mentoring or supporting in some way, shape or form. And so at whatever stage in your career you're at, I think it's important to have the kind of north and south boxed off. And then east and west of you, east, I think, is having colleagues who are perhaps a similar age and stage to you, who understand the industry that you're working in. So probably somebody who's doing the same job as you are at another club or in a different country, who you can just vent to sometimes. You don't necessarily want advice from them. You just want to vent at the frustrations, or you want to share the successes, because they're few and far between. You know, that there's certainly more tough days in coaching than there are great days, to be quite honest. You've got to have that kind of person east of you who's a colleague. And then west of you, I believe you've got to have mates, you know, who might not understand as well that you work and might not even care about it, but the kind of person you can go and have a round of golf with, or sit down and grab a coffee with, or, you know, go off and blow some steam with, you know. And I think actually being deliberate in putting someone in those 4 compass points is a really kind of key principle to help you stay grounded and to help you stay focused and sane in an industry that can be pretty kind of up and down and pretty volatile. And I can certainly speak personally for the fact that being deliberate and putting people in those 4 kind of points of the compass has certainly helped me keep the breadth of the wavelength slightly shorter. You know, the highs and lows, the ups and downs of football. You know, if you can try and maintain a narrower wavelength, so you don't get too over the top when they're going well, you don't get too down when they're going badly. Certainly, putting someone in, or 2 or 3 people in each of those 4 compass points has really helped me. You know.
That's a brilliant way to look at it, and I'm going to be kind of drawing my own little personal compass, soon after this conversation, because I think it's a brilliant idea, and it really, kind of makes something a really good point, very simple, and a great visual as well.
Yeah, it certainly helped me, and it certainly made me a better coach, better man, and I think particularly being proactive in terms of that those people might change and evolve as you evolve and change through your own coaching career or your own work career, whatever they might be. But, actually not being afraid to reach out to somebody and say, listen, can you kind of help me, even as a one-off? Here's a specific question, or here's a specific challenge I'm facing. Can you help me with that? And that's something be surprised how many times when you reach out to high quality people that they don't get back to you, you know. And I think, again, the advice I would give to any young coach coming out is if someone takes the time to reach out to you and ask you a question, you know, have the decency to at least get back to them. Even if you can't help them, at least have the decency to get back to them. So I think back to when I kind of lost a job early on, you know, the reality of football. When I set this is before the kind of the email systems are really up and running, you know. And I mean, I sent out, I think, 166 letters that I mailed by hand, you know, and addressed by hand and stamped off and sent off to people all around the UK and football clubs, kind of because looking to get back into the game. And that 166 letters I sent out, you know, I got 6 replies, and 3 of them were thanks but no thanks. 2 of them were we'll keep your letter on file, which is kind of similar kind of thing, and 1 of them was, you know what, yeah, come and meet us, you know. And it's amazing that to only get 6 replies. And actually, what I've tried to do now is that I've always said, as and when I got into the industry and stayed in it, if someone takes the time to reach out to you, if you can, and as humanly possible at all, do your best to try and get back to them. You know, it might only take you 5 minutes, but just the impact that just getting back to somebody can have is pretty key, you know.
I mean, as a young person, and someone who's on the lowest level of the food chain, I know I would greatly appreciate when I reach out to someone, and just when I reached out to you, you couldn't have been nicer. So I know it does feel really good for people who are seeking some advice and looking up to people like you who have blazed a trail, because I couldn't agree more, because there's just, as you said, I think to start our conversation, standing on giants, no one got there by themselves, and so it's important to pay it forward.
Absolutely, and to me, the key thing I've learned as I've got older is that, you know, this game was here long before I got involved in it, and this game will be here long after I've gone. You know, actually, my job, if I can, is to make the area that I've got responsibility for and the places I'm working, if I can try and leave those places better than when I found them, and I can hopefully have a positive impact on the people that I'm working with, that's really, I guess, the core remit of what we're here to do. You know, this job's about people, you know, and it's about the relationships you build along the way. Of course, you've got to have that professional competency. You've got to be ruthlessly good at your job, but let's not lose sight of the human element to it, you know. I think sometimes the pursuit of winning and pursuit of excellence, you know, the thing that gets sacrificed first is the relationships, and I would argue that that's the most important fundamental to get right in any way, you know. And that's certainly something mistakes I've made along the way when I've not built relationships strongly enough or in the right way, and I've certainly learned from that. And hopefully, as I move forward, I'm sure I'll make more mistakes, but hopefully that's something that I can take with me as I move forward.
Well, relationships last longer than any job does. But speaking of the human element, I want to get back to when you first came to Korea. As someone who was in the same exact situation, how did you adapt to some of the cultural differences, and did you have any especially difficult or embarrassing situations?
Yeah, I think probably if you came to Korea for a 2-week holiday, you'd go away with it having had a really great time, had a really great experience of it, and you'd think you understand the culture very quickly, because the perception is that you build up is one that the people here are very, very friendly, you know, people here are very, very welcoming towards guys from the outside, is what I found, and there's no doubt that is the case. The reality is when you live in a country and you stay for a lot longer and you scratch below the surface, you begin to get a better understanding of what underpins the culture and of the challenges you face here. And if I had to summarise it, what I would say to people now back home is that, you know, Korea, it's not better or worse than England or the UK. It's just different, you know, and it's a very important distinction to make, because the human instinct for us is very quickly to compare where we are to what we've known previously. You know, how does Korea compare to England? How does Korea compare to Scotland or to other countries we've lived in? And that's nothing wrong with that. I understand that, but actually, that isn't necessarily helpful when you come to a completely different culture, because it is going to be very, very different. And things that you and I would accept as being prerequisites or the norm, if you like, are very, very different over here. So in terms of some specifics, you know, in terms of the way that communication happens, football in the UK is a big boy sport. You know, on a regular basis, you'll have tear-ups of people on a regular basis. You know, you'll be butting heads with coaches, with players, with guys in the front office. You know, it's a very, very... You've got to have a rhino skin. You know, you've got to have that ability to go and stand your corner and fight for what it is that you need to be successful. And you've got to develop those kind of survival skills, if you like, within the UK. Now, the advantage of that is that, yes, you might have a tear-up with someone, you might have a little head-to-head with somebody, but my experience in the UK is that you have that flare-up, you have that kind of head-to-head, gets resolved, you shake hands, you crack on, and it's gone. It's forgotten with and you move on. Whereas in career, the need is to try and avoid that conflict as much as possible. The whole concept of conflict over here isn't as kind of out in the open as it would be for us back in England. And so what I've found over here is that the importance of people not losing face is very, very significant. The idea of somebody being embarrassed or humiliated or admitting a mistake is very, very alien to them. And that's not something you'd ever want to do here in terms of embarrassing somebody publicly or humiliating them publicly. So the way that you give feedback on performance, for example, is very key. Whereas in the UK, you might sit down with a video and do a video session with boys and be very frank, highlighting, who was at fault for a particular situation or who needs to improve next time around. When I do that here with players here, I've learned to do that in an individual setting. So just a player and me sat quietly away from other people, because then if I do it in a public setting, they're mortified. The humiliation they feel takes away from the message. Now, of course, we package that information carefully, and we never want to humiliate anybody in any culture, but particularly over here, the need to be delicate in the way that you, I guess, correct and teach is important. The communication's obviously been a real challenge, language-wise. It's really reinforced to me, again, the power of communication and actually making every word count. I think, like a lot of us in coaching, I'll be the first to admit, I get excited, and you talk, you want to talk a lot and get a lot of information in, you want to kind of be really positive and bubbly. But the reality is that over here, you've got to make every word count, because if you're going through a translator, you want to make sure you're making his or her job as easy as possible. And then if you are speaking in the native language, in Korean, you've got to make sure you choose your words very carefully, because sometimes the words get translated, but the message doesn't. So it's re-emphasised to me the importance of communication. And then obviously just the style of football is very different. I mean, that's been the biggest adjustment for me professionally. The way that they train, the way they play over here is very different from what I've seen in the UK. And there's no point in me coming across here and trying to create Little England in the bits that I'm doing, or Little Scotland or Little UK. I can take the best bits from European football and hopefully try and blend it in and knit it into what happens over here in Korea. But we have to be respectful of and adhere to and maintain the Korean way of doing things, because this is their culture, and it's not my job to come in and change everything. It's my job to hopefully improve things step by step. And it's the old cliche that if you want to go fast, you go alone. If you want to go far, you go together. I think particularly that holds water over here in Korea, and taking people on the journey with you is probably quite important over here. And that's something I've picked up and have made mistakes over the course of the first few years or so, and certainly hope to be better at moving forward.
I love that cliche you just gave, because I think it's so true. There's so many of those points that I want to touch upon. I mean, just in terms of the communication, I read that you had to kind of integrate the foreign and Korean players. In the gym, you used to have on the walls English and Korean words so that you could test the guys regularly and learn some English phrases, and you could learn some Korean phrases. Is that true? And how is your Korean right now?
Yes, that certainly is true. Yeah, one of the things we would do in the kind of morning activation sessions is facing the spinning bikes we've got in the gym. We've got a kind of series of we call it a learning wall, which is a bit of a cliche, but just a series of kind of key phrases or key terminology that the English-speaking players we had initially, it's important they understood those in Korean, because in the split second of a game, the Korean players probably not going to have the time to process it in English, and they're going to shout it in Korean. It's important that the overseas players understood that, and vice versa. It's important for the Korean players to understand that if an English-speaking player shouted something in the course of the game, they understood what it was. But also just from a life skills point of view, that sense of, if I can help the Korean players upgrade their English a little bit, that's going to help them in the long term, and so certainly the players here have got a phenomenal work ethic, phenomenal desire to learn, and so I've certainly tried as much as I can to help them learn both professionally in terms of becoming better athletes and better players, but certainly if I can help them with English as well. I think there'll probably be guys back home laughing that look at my English and think it's not perfect at all, and the idea of me being a teacher of English is probably ironic to them. In terms of my Korean is still very basic. It's a very, very complicated language for those people that don't know it. You have to learn the language twice, because you have to learn the alphabet first, and then you have to learn the kind of symbols and Hangul, the kind of written form of Korean. Then once you learn that and learn what each of those sounds and syllables is, then you've got to understand what the Korean word is. And then once you learn the Korean word, then you've got to understand what it means. So it's certainly a long-winded process in terms of learning. I'm able to give instructions in Korean now and coach in Korean. What I'm not able to do by any means is have the kind of rich, deep conversations that you really need to have at a strategic level with chief executives and managers and agents and other stakeholders. That's certainly a challenge at the moment. And so I'm fortunate there's some good people in the club that have got some decent English that can help me with that. Certainly the language side of things. If my contract extends and I stay longer, that's certainly an area that I'll have to upgrade. Because I think probably for English-speaking guys, we get a little bit lazy because around the world there's always people that speak English, and so probably for us we're a little bit lazy mentally in terms of that need to learn language. And certainly for me, I want to kind of shake it up a little bit and really show that I'm able to grasp a completely different language as best as I can.
Yeah, I can totally relate to the difficulty of learning Korean. In my time there, it was just it was because it's so difficult. It can really just kind of defeat you at times when you're almost like, what's the point? Because it can be so challenging. But how did
certainly.
How did you learn? Or because at first it was, I mean, it still is difficult for you, but to communicate in Korean, how did you learn how to communicate? Maybe using like using more physical communication or nonverbal.
Yeah, I think certainly in any coaching environment, even if you're coaching in your native language, I think the importance of demos is really important. In a gym setting, for example, I really believe that anyone working on the physical side of things in the gym or on a conditioning basis needs to be a decent mover themselves. You don't have to be an elite athlete by any means, but I think you do have to be able to demonstrate and hold your own within a physical context, in the gym context. So, and I think that applies out on the field as well in terms of the ability to go and demonstrate what it is you're looking for. And so the young coaches coming through, just actually honing the practical side of your own skills is important. Getting in the gym, trying things. If you're going to put a session on for a player, know what it feels like. Just because the impact of you might have a decent idea from the GPS data you might have availability, or the heart rate data, or RPE, or whatever kind of data streams you may or may not use. You might think you know what it feels like because the data tells you, but until you've actually felt it for yourself, it's hard to really put in context how that session might fit together with other parts of the session. So knowing how sore you are after a squat session, knowing how sore you might be after a session where there's been lots of deaccelerations and a lot of eccentric loading to your hamstrings, and knowing how that might feel the following day is important. And not to say that you should try and mirror everything the athlete does, because that's not what you need to do in the job, but knowing and actually having that kind of visceral experience, if you like, of this is what the players are going through, I believe helps you program better, alongside all the principles from the academic side of things that we all understand. But that sense of just having an idea of what a session feels like, or what a movement feels like, and what it should look like is an important tool. And certainly here in Korea, the need to demonstrate accurately has been important. I've had to upgrade my own demos on and off the field in terms of what I'm looking for. The video has been crucial, I think, from a strategic, tactical point of view. Now, getting players actively involved in their learning, developing, using the videos, analysing their own performances and breaking their own performances down rather than always doing it for them is quite a useful tool. We don't use the video as well as we should do here by any means. It's certainly something that we've kind of tried different options over the course of the last couple of years, but certainly an area that I'm really interested in pushing the envelope on a little bit. I just feel as though the days of just explaining it to players or showing them on a tactics board, we can do better than that, I think, and actually getting them to actively break down their own performance. And one thing that I like from the NFL that I've tried to bring into my own coaching is I love the fact that they do a lot of work in position groups. So again, in the NFL, you'll have guys in defensive backs will be in the room, you'll have the linebackers in the room, you'll have the O-line in the room, and really the shared learning that goes on from guys in the same position, I think, is really key. So, for example, how many times a week go off and do specific position, specific training sessions within our group, within our week? How many times are the centre-backs off working together, the full-backs off working together? We often do a bit of crossing and finishing with the strikers and wide players, but, if you talk about technical, tactical, physical, psychological, the kind of four-corner model that's pretty well spoken of these days, the analogy I give is that the technical side of things that's keeping your tools sharp. So that's if you look at that toolbox we spoke about, that's making sure that every tool in the toolbox is sharp enough to use. So that's the technical side of things. The tactical side of things is knowing how to use those tools. The physical side of things is being able to use those tools year round without you breaking down. And the psychological side of things is being able to use those tools in any situation. And so that analogy in terms of sometimes we get too caught up in the tactical side of things, knowing how to use your tools, but we've neglected keeping the tools sharp, or we've neglected the physical side of things in terms of creating an athlete that can use those tools year in, year out, or most importantly, the psychological side of things in terms of an athlete who can use those tools without them breaking down in any given circumstance. So I think certainly that position group idea is a nice idea, and we've done a little bit of work with that early on, but certainly the first manager I worked with, a guy called Martin Rennie, who'd coached in kind of North America before. He and I were kind of on a similar page with that, and he did some great stuff in terms of position group work particularly. So yeah, certainly another thing I've taken to the NFL.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more, and I'm surprised that I don't see it more common in with football teams because the one that jumps out at me, and I've seen this mentioned, but I think when I was with Omar Chowdhury, he's works for 21st Club, which is like a consultancy firm. He mentioned, and I couldn't agree more, that set pieces account for a third of the goals in games, and yet there's usually it's pretty rare that there's a set piece coordinator. I mean, in the NFL, you have offensive coordinator, defensive coordinator, and then position coaches. But it seems like teams should have a set piece coordinator if it accounts for so many goals scoring and then also defending. It seems like that should scream out, in addition to some of those position coaches. Like obviously you have goalkeeper coach, but there's not a lot of position coaches for these teams.
Yeah, I think it's that balancing act in terms of making sure that we are detailed enough in the information we're giving and making sure we've got enough pairs of hands in the building to help us, and yet at the same time not going too far the opposite way where almost messages start getting confused and people almost jostling for position a little bit in terms of having to justify their role. So yeah, I think certainly we can do it better in football in terms of just making sure we work on the technical side of things, particularly in terms of keeping tools sharp. And the role of specific coaches. There's obviously some clubs now that employ skills coaches and things. So certainly that's something I think we can look into getting better at. But yeah, I think that's an area that we'll probably see evolve a little bit over the next few years.
You've been in sports science for, now you're an assistant manager, but you've been in football for a long time, and you started off at sports science, and obviously you still do a lot of sports science stuff for your current club. What's something that you thought maybe 10, 15 years ago about sports science in particular that you think now is that you've totally changed your mind about?
Yeah, I think it's really an evolutionary process as opposed to revolution. And the old cliche of, I think probably 10, 15 years ago, we wanted to go in and change everything and felt as though we knew everything, we knew it all. And I speak for myself here more than anybody else. There was a lot of very well-meaning young coaches coming out of Olympic sports or coming out of kind of academia who really felt that they had lots and lots of information that could have a positive impact on professional sport, but perhaps went about it the wrong way in terms of, rather than drip feeding that in and working with the coaches to try and build buy-in and build up relationships, perhaps tried to impose it on things too quickly. And I think what's created a little bit of a problem in English football particularly is that I feel there's a little bit of a disconnect between the kind of sports science side of things now and the coaching side of things. Now, not at every club by any means. There's some clubs doing it fantastically well. But obviously I've been coaching now, kind of moved across into the coaching side of things from sports science kind of 6 or 7 years ago. And a number of times I speak to coaches now at conferences or just through LinkedIn or on the phone or whatever it might be. And a number of times that there's almost a slight resentment or a slight bitterness and certainly a lack of understanding on both sides in terms of just not really understanding how relationships should be working. And I think for me, the reason I moved across into coaching was I really wanted to try and to bridge that gap a little bit and try and close that gap, because ultimately the idea of having a physical coach, for example, that's always going to be there. Clubs have often had physical coaches for a long, long time, and will do moving forward. But that's just one part of the game. And I think the idea of viewing the physical side of things in isolation, every other part of the game, is something we've got to be a little bit careful of. Now, I'm not an advocate of the kind of everything can happen through small-sided games movement that a lot of guys are kind of quite kind of big into now. I understand exactly where they're coming from. I've read the science, I've read the articles. There's some great people that have kind of gone that way. I think we have to be a little bit careful. And actually, there is a time to come out of the football, to target a physical area, to then improve it, to then go back in. But yeah, that need to bridge the gap is important. In terms of specifics of things that I look back on that have changed, I think on the recovery side of things now, whereas 10, 15 years ago, now it's very much everybody takes a protein shake, everybody gets in an ice bath, everyone gets a massage. I think now we look at, actually, we underestimated the importance of the social element of recovery and the psychological element of recovery. And the number of battles I've had over the years trying to get guys into ice baths, for example, thinking I was doing them a favour. Well, the reality is I'm probably hurting them, mentally, because they're desperately not wanting to get in there, for example. And so I think now when we look at recovery, the idea of having a range of modalities or range of options that guys can tap into, it's probably how a lot of clubs have gone these days. And certainly I know for guys that I worked with previously have gone that way, and that's something I've probably softened on a little bit. I think we got away a little bit from hard graft. There was almost a sense of, probably 10 years ago, that now the old-fashioned pre-seasons have gone, the idea of slogging your kind of socks off and up and down hills and running on the beaches, all that's gone. We've got to be better than that. And I absolutely agree with that. But I think we probably went too far. And I think a few teams, and certainly in English football, began to mollycoddle players a little bit and wrap them in cotton wool a bit too much, and not create resilient athletes that can tolerate the demands and the load of the game. I think based around that, when the data started creeping into football particularly, a lot of teams would look at the average data, so the reference their performance against average data. Well, the nature of average data is it's in the middle. It doesn't account for the top-end performances. When you're in a really hard game down to 10 men, how much distance do you cover then? How many sprints will you do on a day when you're when you really need to go and counter-attack against a team and push to go and get a win? And the idea of preparing teams and your players for the peaks of performance rather than just average is probably a way that teams have gone now. But at the same time, also recognising that data is just one part of it. So the classic example I give from my own experience is that when I was at Birmingham City in the Championship, all the pros owned data that was around at the time, we were in that championship season, we were top 3 on all the physical data that came out, and everyone's patting themselves on the back saying, "Oh, good job," and we got promoted that year. Following season in the Premier League, we're top 3 in all the parameters again, thinking, "Oh, great job," but we got relegated. And the reality of it is that really highlighted to me, we can't just look at the physical side of things in isolation. And ultimately, the reason why physically we had that data that's fairly high in the Premier League was that we weren't keeping the ball properly. We weren't actually able to do the things we needed to do. Now, that's not a coaching issue or playing issue. It's down to me and my colleagues misinterpreting the data, and just because you run further than somebody else doesn't make you better than them, It's running smarter. So that's certainly something how I've evolved in terms of how we use the data. And young coaches coming out now from university programs are far better equipped than I ever was in terms of their understanding of the GPS data and the understanding of how data can inform decision making. So that's certainly an area that's evolved over the last few years.
Yeah, no, I love what you said. It's better to run smarter than to run further, because if you're always running after the ball, it doesn't matter if you're fitter or you're running more. That's not a great indicator of anything. There's a quote that I read that you gave in a previous interview that I want to bring up, because I think it brings up a really important subject, which is, you said, quote, a huge increase in injuries in the modern game has come from explosiveness of the game these days, and how training methods around the world haven't caught up with this new footballing reality. It is important for clubs to balance fitness and freshness, which I think is at the core problem for most teams these days. So how can coaches balance fitness and freshness, and what are indicators of both, or that coaches should look out for?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think you're right. It kind of speaks to the heart of the challenge of coaching, I think. So the first thing I'd say is that the sports science argument would be use the data. Now, use the data that we can access these days, and there's huge reams of data that we can access these days that, if we interpret it properly, can give us some indications of where someone's at physically. So use the data, but do not underestimate the coach's eye. And that's certainly something that I would preach now to young sports scientists or young coaches coming through, which is to say, people say, is coaching an art or a science? Well, I would argue that it's an art underpinned by science. And we've got to make sure that we give credit and kudos to both sides of that. I've one of the things that Steve Bruce was brilliant at when I worked at Birmingham was that Steve had obviously come through the Man United kind of hierarchy, if you like, and spent much of his playing career under Sir Alex Ferguson. And what Steve had a great instinct for was how to look after his big players, the big name players. And he recognised that those big name players, when it really mattered, those were the players that were going to get him over the line, whether it was a promotion or winning a key relegation battle or whatever it might be. And so his ability to look after those big name players mentally and physically was great. So I, as a younger coach back then, I was pulling my hair out because I'd come in one day and find out that a player I was expecting to do a gym session with, for example, wasn't in the building and be given an extra day off. But actually, looking back on it now, it was really good management because it was him building that relationship with a senior player, giving that player a bit more time with his family, who perhaps lived further away and hadn't come up to Birmingham with them, just allowing some of the foreign players to fly back and see their family on occasions, was great. So I think that speaks to your question in terms of how can a coach, what can a coach do to kind of keep the balance right? Well, yes, use the data, but ultimately talk to your players, speak to your players, know your players, be there before they arrive in the morning, look for the little indicators that might suggest something's not quite right. If a player that's normally quite bubbly comes in a little bit flat, that could be an indication that something's not quite right at home. If a player who lives further away and has to drive in every day, and that journey's taking its toll, bear that in mind. It's almost like the little poker tells. What are the little tells for each individual player that suggest that something might be a little bit off kilter? And then you can go to the data and say, does the data back that up a little bit? Or is the data suggesting something along those lines as well? So not to underestimate the ability of just that fine detail of watching and speaking to players. So that's why I would argue that coaches have to be in the building and actually be speaking to players on a regular basis and talking to them, and not just relying on sports science or conditioning staff to feed data back to them. Because the data hasn't got legs on it. The data hasn't got a beating heart or an active brain. Data can't tell you exactly what's going on in that person's head. So use the data, but don't underestimate the coach's eye.
Yeah, it should be complementary. So you mentioned way earlier in the conversation that the mental aspect of you were talking about the ice baths and getting players to go really get in the ice bath, and how that kind of could create some stress in the relationship. But I'm curious how much mental stress can influence freshness and fatigue, because I know I was at a sports conference and the speaker had this whole presentation essentially on all stress at the end of the day channels into a player's fatigue or stamina, and thus their freshness. And so I was curious what you felt about that.
Yeah, I would certainly argue that and certainly agree with the fact that stress and pressure are multifaceted. We can't just look at one area of that. We can't just look at the physical load or the kind of the training load, whether it's the internal and external load. You can't just look at that. We have to look at the human beings. I think the danger is that in a game that's so kind of driven by finance these days, we begin to look at players as being assets on a balance sheet as opposed to human beings. I would argue that I'm not here to coach players. I'm here to coach men, and we have to make that distinction. Football is what they do; it's not who they are. And actually, that's crucial, I think, in terms of building that relationship, because helping them as their career comes to an end, because we've seen all the data out there and all the stats out there from every sport going in terms of that transition out of playing into kind of the real world, if you like, is very traumatic for a lot of players, and the fans and punters just see the money and think, well, what have they got to complain about, without necessarily understanding the psychological impact of your career coming to an end, or having to effectively retire in your mid-30s and have 40 years of life left still, you know. So that's a little aside. But yeah, I would argue that the psychological load on a player is something we have to take into account, and that's not necessarily something you can quantify really regularly or easily with data. Of course, you can look at some psychological profiles and some wellness data and wellness questionnaires and things, and they help with that. But I found that the best thing I can do is just know the players as best as possible, and know them as men. You know their wives' name, know their children's names. You know the challenges they face at home. You're not there to be their counsellor. You're not there to be some guru for them or anything, but just recognise and value them as human beings, and recognise as human beings, as we all do in any walk of life we're in, you know, our emotional state, our psychological state is going to have an impact on our professional abilities. And recognising that, and that balancing act between, as you said earlier on, not wrapping them in cotton wool, but at the same time being aware of that is important for coaches.
Well, I mean, it's a basic level of almost respect. I mean, it goes for when I was a teacher. You know, you have to know certain things to respect them, and they'll have that much more respect for you if you take the time to go out of their way.
And what I would say and what I say to young coaches is that it's a very difficult. It's probably the hardest thing for a young coach coming into the game who's a similar age to the players, in that sense of walking the line of where you draw the line of that relationship, because you want to build a relationship with them, but you're not there to be their friend. You're not there to be their mate. You're not there to go out drinking with them. You're not there to go out chasing girls or clubbing with them. You know, you've got to draw that line very, very clearly in the sand. It says, my job here is to help you reach your potential as a human being and your potential as a player, and I'll do all I possibly can to do that. And so understanding your kind of well-being, your psychological makeup is part of that, but I'm not here to be your friend. Because ultimately we've got to have that professional distance, we've got to have that professional integrity, because there's going to be times when I've got to give a rocket to someone. There's got to be times I've got to go eyeball to eyeball with someone and have a tear-up. There's got to be times I've got to deliver news that they don't want to hear. And actually it's important to make sure that you don't blur those lines, and particularly for young coaches coming in. And the principle I would use with some of the interns we had and mentored over the years is to say to them that, use the nighttime rule. You know, I believe that when the sun's shining during the day, generally things are good. When things start getting dark and there's dark corners and things, you're socialising boys in the dark, I think bad things happen. So fine, go and have a cup of coffee with someone after training, great. Might have a round of golf with someone in the afternoon, fair enough. But when the light starts to fade at that point, create that separation at that point. And it sounds daft, but yeah, bad things happen after dark.
Well, in Korea, I mean, you're talking about a country where they don't believe that at all, that you have to be with people at night. I mean, I don't know if you've had any of your, any work dues or, events with people at work, but, it's common in Korea to have, as I'm sure nighttime outings with everyone from your job.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, again, that's a huge adjustment for me in terms of For me, I love football, I love coaching, but football is what I do, is not who I am, as I mentioned early on. And for me, when I get home, I want to get home and see my family in the evenings. I spend most of my life away from them as it is, and I'm keen to get home and see my wife and family. So for me, trying to delineate kind of work and home is important for my own well-being and to make sure that I can be a decent husband and father. And so, yeah, for me, the idea of going out socialising and drinking late at night with kind of my colleagues and coaches was just one that I couldn't get my head around it, but honest. And the way I approached it was I was very, very clear and very kind of upfront with guys at the start. So listen, I'll work my socks for the football club. I'll pour my heart and soul into helping you be better and you helping me be better and do all I can for this club. But when my work day's finished, I'm going home. And again, it's easier for me to do that because I don't exist within the Korean hierarchy, which is very strong over here. And not being a kind of native Korean means it's easier for me to make that line in the sand, if you like. It's much harder for the kind of young Korean coaches here to draw that line because of the very, very clear, strong age-based hierarchy over here. So yeah, I do feel for the young coaches on that, certainly.
Yeah, no, it is so true. But to get back to the quote that I mentioned before, where you talked about the explosiveness of the game today. You mentioned early in our conversation that you like to do that through sprinting. Is there any other ways that you train for explosivity, and or are there any other good exercises or drills to do that besides sprinting?
Yeah, again, I mean, I would speak certainly as somebody who would be very open to being a magpie on this. You know, I steal my best ideas from people on this, and I'm very upside in saying that. You know, there's people who are far more experienced, more skilled, have a better skill set than I do in terms of explosiveness. I would argue, and again, I'll make it as simple as possible, I think if you want to get quicker, you have to be sprinting maximally. And so I believe in a physical development program, there has to be times in a week or in your program where guys are working at maximum velocity, not 95%, not 90%, but they are flat out. And in order to do that, you have to create a resilient athlete physically in the gym, but you have to make sure that they're giving that exposure to that maximal movement, because they're going to see it in a game. That's ultimately what it comes down to. I'm not interested in making guys quicker between the timing gates, to be quite honest with you. And that was a mistake I think some young coaches make, thinking they have to justify their own existence by showing percentage improvements in vertical jump tests or speed gates. Yeah, of course, that's part of what we do. But the core thing is, does it help them on a Saturday? Is it help? Are you exposing them to the kind of things they might face on a Saturday? So the classic example I give is be a centre-back. So a guy that plays as a centre-back in the team. The way that most training sessions be built up in lots of clubs means actually those centre-backs can go through a week probably without actually having to sprint over longer distances. So we know that the average sprint distance in a game is 15 metres. We know it's 15 to 20 metres. But the centre-backs are on occasion going to have to chase the ball over their shoulder into channels and go further, might have to go 40 or 50 yards at getting towards maximal velocities to go and react to a counter-attack or go and close a wide down the wide area. And actually the number of times that those centre-backs have to do that in a game over the course of the season, but they've not faced that challenge over the course of a week in training. So just making sure that we relate what we do in training to what they're going to face on the game. So first thing, certainly making sure they work at maximum velocities over varying distances over the course of a week. I'm a firm believer. I do believe guys have to lift explosively in the gym. There's guys better than me. There's a great guy, Brett Bartholomew, who's just written a book called Conscious Coaching, who's a strength coach working out in the US. And he just makes it real simple. He just talks about athletes lifting different weights at different speeds at different times in the week. You know, and that's what I think it should be doing. You know, we're not looking to create guys that look great with their shirt off, or we're not looking to have circus acts that can balance on top of Swiss balls, juggling medicine balls. But we've got to have guys that are resilient for the game. So I believe you've got to externally load players, not just use body weight exercises. You've got to externally load them. They've got to lift explosively at different points in the season, different points in the week, and they've got to work explosively as well. One key thing tied into that, I believe, is making sure we work on deaccelerations. I think lots of teams work on, and I certainly have made the mistake of working on accelerations, but not necessarily enough on the ability to stop efficiently and to move well and know how to stop and how to change direction. So that's certainly something I think in the younger age groups particularly is important, getting that kind of fabric in place early on. But again, doing it in a football context. How many times do you start a drill on a whistle? Well, during the course of the game, what happens when you hear a whistle in the game? Well, generally you stop. The whistle is blown to stop a game. And actually we use that as a stimulus. You know, how many times in a game do you go from standing still to maximal speed? You don't. If you look at the game, you look at the profile of the game, it tends to be you go from a walk into a jog, into a change of direction, into a turn, into a pivot, up to a high-speed run and then into a sprint. You know, in that sense of how many times do we do sprint work that starts from a standing start? Well, does that mirror the demands of the game would be the question I'd ask to that. Not to say you never do it, but just to say, is the work we're doing related back to the game? And the game should be the start point for everything that we program.
Yeah, it goes back to the expression you had way earlier when you were talking about rowing. Does it get you that much faster in the race? But you mentioned that book by Bartholomew. Is there any other? Is there any other resource that you regularly look at, whether it be a website or a magazine, or is there any other books that really stand out to you as resources for you to keep sharp and stay current with other coaches in the field?
Yeah, I'm absolutely. The first thing I'd say is I'm an avid reader. I love to read, love to learn. You know, and read all kinds of books, not just limited to the kind of the field that I'm working in, but just read all kinds of things. So some examples of stuff that I've read recently. I really enjoyed, I think his name's Dr. Jim Afram-Moe, who wrote a book called The Champion's Mind. Really enjoyed that. Very easy to read, kind of psychological-based book, looking at kind of elite performance from the kind of mental side of things. Really enjoyed that. He gave some examples in that book of things like the importance of body language. The phrase he used was, warriors don't slouch into battle, which I really like that one. He talks about how, nerves are part and parcel of elite performance, but, can you get your butterflies to fly in formation? I took lots of little sound bites from his book, really enjoyed that. I read some great, there's a guy, if you talk about the northeast, southwest, if you like, one of the kind of colleagues that I bounce ideas off is a guy called Adam Owen. He and I kind of came through the kind of FA coaching path together, kind of back in the early 2000s, and he's gone on to do great things and worked. He was at Rangers when I was at Celtic, and he's gone on to work at Benfica and is now working out in Poland, and he's produced some great resources, and he shares a lot of great stuff through Twitter. So certainly Dr. Adam would be a guy I'd recommend. Tony Strudwick, who we mentioned early on, he's spent a long time at Man United. He's written some great kind of athlete development book, or a great athlete development book recently that was a kind of really good thing to look at. From a speed and power point of view, a guy called Dr. Mike Young, who's based out in North Carolina in the US, owns a gym called Athletic Lab. He shares a lot of his resources through a blog that's linked into their gym and their training centre that they run. So yeah, Dr. Mike Young is a great speed specialist, particularly great athlete himself, and has got some great ideas in terms of speed and power development. Certainly learned a lot from him. But just encouraging guys to read widely, not just to limit themselves to the obvious things, reading within their sphere. There's a good book by a guy called Matthew Syed here in the UK, who is a former professional table tennis player who's gone on to become a journalist for the Times newspaper. He's written a couple of books, one called Bounce a few years ago, and a very interesting one recently called Black Box Thinking, which just looks at how we deal with failure, how we categorise mistakes, and how different industries deal with that. And I've learned some great stuff from that. I think that's a book I'd certainly recommend to guys out there. And again, just coming back to the NFL again, which has been, a theme running through, just studying from good coaches. I haven't got enough hours in the day to make every mistake that other coaches in the world have made. So if I can learn from their mistakes by reading what they've done, that helps me. So I really enjoyed reading Lou Holtz's autobiography, a very famous coach from Notre Dame University. Great thing I took from him was he used a great quote, which I loved, which was, don't wrestle with pigs. You both get muddy, but the pig enjoys it. And actually that idea of, there's going to be people that question what you do. There's going to be people that are looking to knock you down. There's going to be people that are looking to wrestle you in the mud, and actually recognising that in the long run, you both get muddy. So don't shoot your mouth off criticising other coaches. If you see a photo on Twitter or a Instagram video of a player doing something you don't like or you don't agree with, what do you gain by publicly slating that? What do you gain by publicly undermining somebody else? You don't know their story. You don't know the context of the session. That's an area within sports science and coaching that I dislike at the moment. Is people are very quick to be critical of other programs, of other people's kind of situations, and other people's philosophies and things. And I understand why it happens. I understand why some people do it, but just let's keep humility in what we do. We're in the service industry. We're here to serve our athletes, serve our colleagues, serve our coaches. So, just have a little bit of humility about that. So, and I picked that up from some of the biographies I've read as well. So, certainly I'm quite active on Twitter, sharing ideas as well. So, and learning from other people and retweeting and stuff, and always happy to connect with people through that medium as well. So, lots of good stuff recently.
I mean, those. Thank you for giving me so many good books and websites. I mean, that's just a treasure trove of information, and for all the people listening, I'll put links to those in the show notes so people can access them for themselves, because that's just, there's so much good information that you just shared, especially some of those quotes are just fantastic. I was curious, Dan, I don't want to take too much of your time. Do you have 20 more minutes? I mean, I know you're a busy guy and you want to get back to your kids and your wife, but is 20 more minutes all right? Listen, I already taken so much. If us chatting away and us talking can help any kind of younger guys coming in in any way, then more than happy to share ideas, and not promising to be the oracle by any means, not promising to be any kind of guru or expert at all, but certainly happy to share what I've learned over the years, certainly. Okay, wonderful. Because I still have a couple really important questions that, I think. So one of the things that you mentioned earlier was about saving face, and you learned to in Korea kind of do a lot of your stuff one-on-one. There's another thing that you mentioned, how Koreans are a little bit different, which was. Let me just read a quote that I saw that you said was, over here, there is such humility and a respectful nature that really holds guys back from expressing themselves. In the UK, we all know players who go into dressing rooms with all the gear and no idea. But that swagger and belief in themselves can get those players through. There isn't that sort of thing over here. So what, I guess, combined with the humiliation, but or not the humiliation, but the saving face that we talked before, how can you get players that are not naturally confident to kind of go above and beyond their natural confidence, or lack thereof, for that matter?
Yeah, and I certainly wouldn't claim to have all the answers for that, because that's obviously a real challenge for every coach around the world. But certainly in the Korean context, what I found is that the idea of being in a hierarchy, the idea of being respectful is a fantastic thing, and I understand how it's underpinned the cultural society here in terms of the very rapid growth of this country over the last 50 years, and particularly when you go deeper into the history of the country as to why that's been established. But in a football context, we have to know that on a Saturday at 3 o'clock or whenever your game is, when those 11 men cross the white line to go into battle or to go and try and win a game for you, every single one of those guys has to contribute. It can't be left just to the senior guys. It can't be left to the most experienced guys. Everyone's got to contribute. And what we've tried to do here, and again, made lots of mistakes and certainly aren't succeeding by any means, but that sense of a player having a bit more control over their own performance. I think probably for some of the younger guys out here, there's a little bit of the sense that says, well, there's older guys in the team here, and when I get to their age, I'll take responsibility at that point. But actually, the reality of it is that, take, for example, the AC Milan goalkeeper, Donnarumma, who's a guy who, I think he made his professional first-team debut in Serie A for AC Milan at age 16 years old, and is still playing now at 18, 19 years old. Now, the idea of a 16-year-old making their debut in a professional team in Korea is almost unheard of. Now, again, it's rare around the world, but here a young player is seen as being 22, 23, 24, whereas in England or Scotland or Europe, a young player would be seen as being 17, 18, 19. And actually, that's quite a big difference, particularly in Korea, where you have mandatory military service still, where every player has to go off and do 2 years in the Korean military still before the age of 28. If you're seen as being a young player at 22, 23, 24, and you've got to go and do your military service before the age of 28, the reality is there's a very small window for you to actually play. And so what we're trying to do with these lads here in Korea is to say, actually, if you make a mistake, don't beat yourself up over it. Don't live in fear of making a mistake. If you make a mistake, I'm not going to eat your lunch for that. Actually, if you make a mistake and it goes wrong, try again. People talk about pass percentages. He's got a 91, 92% success rate with his passing. Well, why is that? I could go and play a game now and go side to side and pass the ball side to side and have a decent pass percentage. The player I'm more interested in is the one who tries to play forward. Now, he might give the ball away more often, but he's going to create things for you. And that sense of not being afraid of making a mistake probably underpins what we're trying to do with young guys here. And actually then understanding that making a mistake isn't wrong. Making a mistake is part of the game. How you react to it is obviously important, and not making the same mistake repeatedly, but just not being afraid to fail. Not being afraid. It's a horrible cliche, and it's not one I particularly like. That old idea of, I'd rather choke on greatness and nibble on mediocrity. Now, again, it's a glib quote, but I understand the sentiment behind it. That sense of players trying things, expressing themselves. Don't fall into the lazy mindset that says, well, we'll just sign foreign players to score our goals, or we'll just sign some foreign players to create for us. There's no reason why a Korean player can't score 20 goals a season. There's no reason why a Korean player can't be fantastic dribbling 1v1. We've just got to try and create a situation where players feel safe enough to do it.
I couldn't agree more. And when I was teaching English there, I used to see it all the time. Kids wouldn't answer a question that I would ask them, or when I would try to speak to them, because they were too scared to make a mistake and fail and look bad in front of other people. So I'm curious how you tried to get kids, or not, I mean, in your case, not kids, how you got your players to encourage them to be fearless and to be okay with mistakes.
Yeah, I think that you corrected yourself, but you used the word kids, and that's important. It's got to be put in place younger than the age I'm working at, to be quite honest. By the time the players get to me at senior level, it's difficult. What we've got to try and do is have an impact lower down, and have an impact within the kind of coaching systems lower down. Now, we've got an academy here that's very new, and there's some great people working in our academy. I haven't got the opportunity at the moment to spend much time with those guys because they're on a separate site from us. But I would suggest that for us to have a real meaningful impact on that here and anywhere, really, we've got to get that in place younger. And so for those guys who are working at academy level around the world, don't underestimate the importance of the role that you have. People are often desperately striving to get out of academy football into senior football. And I think the idea that what the foundation those guys are laying is actually so crucial. So don't underestimate the work you're doing. If you're working at an under 9 level or under 11 level with young kids in academies, don't underestimate the importance of what you're doing, because the foundation you lay has a direct impact when they get to my end with the senior guys, But yeah, we certainly do try with our senior players. We try and, I think, showing players success and actually using the video as a positive reinforcement tool. So often around the world, I've sat in video meetings where it's just like a horror show of showing them every mistake from the game, every poor decision from the game. But the powerful impact that guys have of publicly seeing their good performances put on a screen, so their teammates and colleagues can see them doing something well, and the message that sends out to them is important. So yeah, that positive affirmation certainly is a useful tool in terms of reinforcing the things you're looking for as well as highlighting the things you want to improve.
I couldn't agree more, especially with the last thing you said, which was highlighting the good performances or good aspects. I mean, as a teacher, that's what I always used to do, and it's amazing how much just one of those events, like, that a kid will be thinking about that a week later, 2 weeks later, of that one moment that you highlighted their a good moment. It's incredible how long that can really stick with someone.
Well, I think the point you make there about teaching, I mean, there may well be some teachers listening to this, and if we think back to our own childhood, the teachers that we remember now, the chances are we don't remember what it was that they taught us, but we do remember the way they made us feel. And actually now I think about teachers that I had as a 6, 7, 8-year-old, and the way they made me feel has underpinned the career path I've ended up taking. I had a PE teacher, when I was kind of 7, 8, 9 years old. It was just magnificent. She was magnificent, and she couldn't have been more positive. And I couldn't remember a single thing she taught me, to be quite honest. But I do remember the way she made me feel about myself. And I also remember the opposite in other areas. There's my wife's a musician, a very hugely talented musician, great singer, great songwriter, great musician. But I can pinpoint a music teacher from when I was 12 years old, and again, I don't remember anything that she taught me, but I do remember the way she made me feel. It's a complete opposite. And again, my wife laughs now. I haven't got a musical kind of note in my body, but part of that probably is because of my recollections of how I felt in those lessons with that particular teacher. So again, any teacher listening here, don't underestimate the impact that you're having on these young men and women's lives, and particularly the way that you treat them as human beings. That has a huge impact later in life.
Something that I had Mark Sutcliffe, who is the CEO of the Hong Kong FA, said. Now we had a little disagreement. I thought that in Korea it was still most fans were kind of European fans first. They supported Manchester United or a British team or a European team first, and then a Korean team second. Would you agree with that? And I'm curious how you feel the league in general can get more fans to support a Korean team first.
Yeah, obviously, you mentioned Mark. Mark's not a guy that I know, so obviously wouldn't know his kind of his story or his background and things, but certainly I can speak from my experience here in Korea. My experience has been that most football fans certainly follow European football, and particularly are drawn to teams where there's a Korean player playing overseas, which is understandable. And so there's nothing wrong with that at all. It's certainly something we have to accept. That does pose challenges for the domestic game. There's no doubt there's a number of very key challenges that the K-League and the KFA and all those involved in the kind of administration and management of the game here are facing, in terms of the strategy, in terms of the practicality, in terms of the finances, and setup of the league and stuff. Certainly lots of challenges here. I'm not well placed to be able to speak with any kind of authority on that. There's people far brighter than me that would understand the kind of the ins and outs of the kind of challenges at a macro level. But in terms of how can we create more interest in the domestic game, we have to have storylines. So what is it? Think about the storylines from your club. What is it that the affinity you have with the club? So again, we talked earlier on about what you asked me the question, why did I start following the Baltimore Ravens? Well, I look at their first ever draft and the first ever draft picks they made. Guy Jonathan Ogden and Ray Lewis came out of that first draft, and those guys who then went on to become storied players within that franchise. There was a storyline that you could follow there. There was a connection or a hook that kind of people wanted to be part of. And I think that need for some kind of connection is important. And what I mean by that in a football context would be, there's nothing like seeing a homegrown young player come through. In England, for example, a young player who comes out of the academy will always be given much more time and much more opportunity to develop and flourish by fans, not necessarily by chief executives and coaches, but fans love to see homegrown talent come through. Fans love to have a connection. One of the reasons, for example, why Celtic got this hugely storied history, and again, a team as we chatted about early on, was that when they won the European Cup back in the 60s, the team was made up of 11 men, all of whom were born within 30 miles of Glasgow. Now, I mean, that's unheard of in today's game, but it's an incredible storyline that connects and resonates with people. So certainly need to create storyline. And actually, I think from a fan's point of view, fans need to be part of the game, not just spectators at it. And actually, I think maybe in career, partly because of the way that the role that sports has, is that you go to watch an activity rather than participate in it. And it's almost like it's a spectator sport, which sounds like a oxymoron because it clearly is. But what you want those spectators to become fans. You want the fans to play an active role in the game. So I look back over my career at the games that stick in my memory. It's the games where the fans are actively involved in the game. When you play a game under the floodlights at Anfield against Liverpool on a Tuesday night, and you hear "Never Walk Alone" being played, it makes the hairs on the back of the neck stand up. I mean, it's a visceral emotion. I mean, you sit on the bench under those floodlights on a cold Tuesday night when you've got 50,000 Scousers singing their hearts out. I mean, it's like phenomenal. I mean, the atmosphere at that stadium is unbelievable. Now, not to say that you don't get that anywhere else, but the fans there were actively involved in the games. I think back over my career, those are the games that you cling on to. So I think in career, we've got to try and find a way of turning spectators into fans. And I think storylines certainly play a big part in that.
Well, I mean, I know that it they can be quite passionate at times, and it's like that when you go to a baseball game. Have you been to a baseball game yet? I mean, you're right.
Yeah, I've taken my son. Yeah, we've been along 2 or 3 times. So,
I mean, you're right next to it, and I mean, I think you guys play in the Olympic Stadium, right?
Yeah, that's one of our challenges. The legacy of the World Cup here in 2002, and obviously the Olympics back in '88, was that you've got some phenomenally looking stadiums, fantastic arenas. Vast majority of them hold over 50,000 people. Now, if you've got 10,000 fans in a 50,000-seater stadium, it feels like it's empty. Whereas you'd rather have 5,000 fans in a 5,000-seater capacity stadium and you get the atmosphere. Like, I think about games that I've been involved in from a playing point of view, where there might only be a couple of hundred or a couple of thousand playing, a couple of thousand kind of watching it, but they're right on top of you and the ground's full. It feels amazing. You get the atmosphere created. So certainly the stadiums are a challenge here, no doubt.
Well, before I let you go, what do you have any requests for the people listening, or how can people contact you or find you or get in touch? Or
yeah, I think in terms of requests, I'm like I say, I'm always keen to learn. So if anyone's kind of read things that are of interest, or kind of come across any coaching resources or sports science resources, or any kind of inspirational books they've read, by all means, kind of reach out and let me know that. I'd love to kind of pick people's brains on that. In terms of best contact points, you can get me through Twitter. You can get me through LinkedIn. Again, I'll do my best to get back to people. With the time difference over here, apologies if there's a delay, and I'm not saying I'm perfect. Sometimes I do forget to get back to people like any other people do as well. So certainly you can get me on either of those two meetings. And yeah, like I say, our season finishes here in end of October, start of November, depending on the playoff situation. So I'll be back in the UK in December, come what may, obviously depending on the contractual situation and things. So yeah, always happy to kind of sit down and grab coffees with people and have a chat and share ideas and pick people's brains as well. So yeah, certainly, like I say, I think as I've got older, the older I've got, the less I know, in the sense of you become aware of the fact that there's so much out there to learn from, and you can learn from other people's mistakes and learn from their experiences as well. So yeah, happy to connect with people through either LinkedIn or Twitter.
It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
No, not at all, Josh. Like, hopefully helpful. Hopefully there's kind of people out there that can take something from it, and appreciate your time as well. So thank you.
Thanks for listening to the show. If you enjoyed it, subscribe to it on iTunes, Stitcher, Podcast Addict, Acast, or any podcasting catching app. Want to learn more about the guests and go behind the scenes? Then go to my website, www.footballautobiographyshow.com, and subscribe to my newsletter. Also, if you like the show, or even if you hated it, leave a comment on either my Twitter page at footballautobio or my Facebook page, The Football Autobiography Show. I welcome and would appreciate any feedback from you all. Thanks for listening. Take care.